reaction to Vivek Ramaswamy, an interview that he gave on the Bitcoin Standard podcast. And there's two things that I like about Vivek. I paid attention to him because he seems like a very eloquent person to say certain things that are obvious and politically very important, but that are sometimes difficult to formulate in a sort of way that is useful. What I mean with that is the following. There's one thing that he talks about a lot, and that's why he was on the podcast, which is his critique on stakeholder capitalism. And I think the way he formulates it is very directly, let's say, useful. It's not just a political statement, oh, these are communists, this is a disguised way of collectivism. No, he has a game theoretic approach towards these things, and that's what's so powerful. The other thing that he criticized on the Bitcoin podcast is actually Bitcoin itself, and not necessarily Bitcoin as a currency and money, but the sort of the tendency of Bitcoiners, which is people who support Bitcoin as a currency, to then infiltrate into other areas. And I believe the reason he does that is because this is kind of the same thing like, let's say, ESG, a movement that he criticizes a lot, where he's basically telling the Bitcoin community, listen, stick with your field. Don't try to extrapolate into all kinds of other fields. That's dangerous. And that is actually exactly what let's say, the ESG movement is doing, or critical race theory or whatever, which is you try to implement policies in different areas because you try to implement policy in the back door because you can't implement it in the front door. This is not in wrong podcast. It's January 19th, 2023. This is Krim Dalko. For the day, the fund is down 3.2%. The market is down 1.2%. For the year, we are up 2.3%. The market is up 1.2%. We're outperforming by 1.1%. There is some macro backlash going on in the market. In other words, I think the fear of inflation, the fear of rate hikes of the Fed and those sort of things is now abating. And now the real fear is coming, which is the recession, which under many measurements we're already in. But the one thing, of course, that's not holding well is the labor market, still very tight, and that is scaring the market. So this is, I would say, in a nutshell, what's going on. What we need now is the softening of the labor market, so then all the other metrics such as growth and retail sales and so on and so forth can then hopefully start recovering with the Fed changing the stance. This is the playbook. I think we are in for maybe another couple of months of toughness until we get back to a better situation in the market. At least this is the way it stands now. For us, we are exposed to what I call special situations. Tesla is a special situation. Tesla has just lowered prices. We've spoken about this extensively. Tesla is a disruptor. So there's lots of special situation type qualities in the situation with Tesla and also with the biotech stocks. But let's focus on Tesla. And I think the fundamental situation with Tesla as far as the portfolio and the stock is concerned is the following. When the Treasury hit peak, so when the Treasury yield hit peak, which was around October 2022, since then the Treasury yield has declined by almost 100 basis points. And at the same time, we had a recovery of growth stocks. So Nvidia, Facebook, all these kinds of stocks, they recovered. Tesla didn't, for fundamental reasons, which we've discussed extensively, things like the demand and margins and so on and so forth. We believe that Tesla is now back on track to actually deliver the kind of growth that we think they are going to deliver for the next couple of years. We have the investor day coming up. We have competitive strength because pricing is in line. So there's a lot of good things happening with Tesla, which is giving us enough confidence to hopefully get back to at least in line with growth stocks, which would be almost doubling of the stock in the next 6 months, despite a rough macro background. So this is sort of where we live right now as far as the fund is concerned. On the biotech side, we don't have any hard data. We hope that the trials keep going with Intellia and Beam. Those are the two stocks we're exposed to. And that, like we said a few times now in the last couple of months, that the biotech side is like everything else, is going to be a show me the money type of situation, where either fundamental results on the ground help the stocks, or we have some M&A. Now let's get to Vivek Ramaswamy and his conversation on the Bitcoin Standard podcast. So there's two things I want to discuss here that really caught my attention. One is his elaboration of ESG as a scam, and I think that's very important. ESG is a movement that started with BlackRock CEO Larry Fink writing a letter and basically demanding from S&P 500 companies to be more engaged in social issues, environmental issues, governance issues, so on and so forth. Now, fundamentally, when he did that, on first sight, I personally thought that's okay. I mean, shareholder activism is not a bad thing. But on closer sight, it turns out that it is a scam. It is a scam because it is a trial by let's say the woke left, or by political interests to move agendas their way on the back door, which is through the financial markets, that the agendas that they couldn't move to the front door, which is the right way to do it in a society, which is through, at least in our society, which would be through Congress, lawmakers on the federal and state level. So because they can't do it, they can't, let's say, enforce an equity audit at Apple through the law. This is just not possible in a democracy. They're doing it on through this ESG backdoor. So this would be the first statement, which is a statement that, in my view, is important. But that's not really the sort of the big revelation. I think he's going further, and he's kind of using a game theoretic argument here. He's saying, look, when we circumvent the law like this, okay, when we do things along the lines of saying, well, we have, let's say, environmental concerns, but then we use them for political reasons to, let's say, drive an agenda of let's say, critical race agenda or something like that, or environment agenda or whatnot. When we do these things, then we run the risk of even more mission creep. We're opening a Pandora's box. And then he's using the example of, imagine if shareholders got together and demanded of ExxonMobil to fix prices. Imagine they did that. That would be outrageous. Well, this is the same thing. It's just, instead of fixing prices, they're fixing, let's say, a hiring policy, or they're fixing things like, well, which supplier should they use? The supplier that is, using fossil fuels, or a supplier that's using solar panels. Like, things like that should not be imposed through the boardroom and shareholders. They should be imposed in the political system. But the main problem that Vivek has, which is really the powerful argument, is, look, if you as a person, if you as a shareholder, if you think that you want to do that, if you want to buy shares of companies that only hire, let's say, people of certain color, then you should do that with your own money, but not take like BlackRock and State Street and these people take other people's money and drive an agenda that the people whose money you're managing most likely either don't even know about, or maybe don't even agree. So this has to be very explicit. This has to be explicit in the sense that the fund then has to call itself, let's say, an ESG fund or something like that, and then people should explicitly invest in something like that. And that's not what's going on. What's going on is that people are basically, putting their money, their retirement money, into funds, like, again, State Street or Vanguard or whatever. They're forced by government to do that in many cases, public employees, people like that. They are forced to put their money in certain funds. Those funds then have mandates of how to manage the money and so on and so forth. These are regulated investments. These are not discretionary hedge fund type investments where the hedge fund manager has a sort of a theme and then invests and things like that. No. These are very regulated assets, and because they're regulated, they are actually governmentally, overseen. And then nevertheless, we have these people, let's say in the case of BlackRock, who take their liberty and drive a political agenda, even though, again, the money, the purpose of that money is to save for retirement. It's not to change political views. So this is, in my view, a very powerful argument. The other argument Vivek makes on the podcast is the argument, which is kind of related to this first one, and that's the argument of, let's say, one thing that I don't like about Safadin Ammous and the Bitcoin maximalists is that they're trying to, they have a hammer, which is Bitcoin, and everything to them looks like a nail. So they want to solve every societal problem through the lens of fiat money. And if we replace fiat money with something, like say a Bitcoin, then we solve the problem. We solve the problem of, government collectivism, of things like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, people that just yell and scream and want to take other people's money and then waste it on government policy and things like that. That, according to Vivek, can happen also with Bitcoin, because the government has the monopoly on violence. The government can always find ways to take your money. It doesn't matter if it's Bitcoin, gold, or whatever. Now, Safadin says, yeah, but it's harder, and so on and so forth. And then Vivek makes this really powerful argument, which is, well, yes, but because it's harder, it might actually backfire, because right now the government can confiscate our money relatively easy by just printing money. That's the situation we're in. That's why Bitcoin is, so important, and the Bitcoiners are all in favor of that. However, maybe there are certain tendencies of the government that are innate in the government, which is this desire to control, this desire to take other people's money and do something with it. This has been around since the, Byzantine kings and so on and so forth. This is not something that was invented with fiat money. Fiat money just accelerated it, and fair enough. I mean, that's a point that Vivek concedes, but he's just saying, look, if we Bitcoiners now start propagating the idea that governments all of a sudden can't do that anymore, if we sort of do a victory lap and we say, we invented this thing called Bitcoin, and this thing called Bitcoin now forever and ever will stop governments from having control over citizens and stop governments from being able to confiscate their wealth through inflation, well, then they'll just find other ways to confiscate our wealth. And this, to me, is a very, very powerful argument. He's saying, look, let's do this, let's do the game theory here. What does that mean? What does it mean, let's do the game theory? It means that, listen, let's look at the repercussions of, you change one variable. Let's say you take away the money. You take away the money printing press, which is you basically take away the ability of governments to influence outcomes through the monetary press. So let's say, yeah, you can do that. Fair enough. But are you going to take away the tendency of governments to influence outcomes? And the answer is no, because that tendency has nothing to do with money. What we went through with COVID is actually a stark reminder of how close even our society is, how just a couple of weeks of panic policy and rogue bureaucrats such as Fauci can drive a whole democratic society, or a society that we thought were democratic, into complete collectivism. We were in lockdowns. We had people telling us, in California it wasn't as bad, thank God, which is a testament to this western part of the United States, that even today, even despite all the the ridiculous policies that we hear and that are happening in particular in the state of California, when the push came to shove, when actually the policies were implemented, all the lockdowns and all that, people were pretty benign. Police didn't go around force you to wear masks and all that stuff. None of that happened, which is just, and we actually lived in San Francisco, so in sort of one of the how do you say, high bourgeois of collectivism in the United States. Nevertheless, it's still, well, I wouldn't say it's a high bourgeois of collectivism. It's a high bourgeois of left-wing democratic activism with a big portion of hypocrisy, and that's why probably the rich in San Francisco, for example, they found a way to protect their wealth and their freedom. Nevertheless, they pretend to be collectivists and things like that. But let's get back on point. I think Vivek's argument is so powerful here. It really is. This is so important. When you change one variable, things evolve around that variable. And if you take away, let's say, the ability of governments to print money and confiscate wealth, they'll find other ways to do that. So we have to be very careful about that. And I think that's a really powerful argument. So again, I think Vivek Ramaswamy is a very interesting, sharp thinker. I like his approach, his game theoretic approach to issues. And to get back to the first issue, the one of his books, which is Woke Inc., and then another one, I think, A Nation of Victims, where he attacks this collectivist tendencies of the left to try to impose policies on our society that are collectively unwanted, and only a few, let's say, minorities want. And he's attacking the sort of backdoor policies of ESG. So let's say financial markets, or what I call mission creep. So let's say somebody like BlackRock takes it upon them to impose policies on our corporates when that's not really what their mandate is. Their mandate is to manage pension money, not to change policy. But because we can't change policy through the front door, let's say in Congress, he argues we're doing it through the back door, and that's very dangerous. And then the other argument, again, that he made, this is a summary, that if you have a good thing, let's say Bitcoin, decentralized money, you create hard money, that's a good thing. Don't use it to drive other policies. That's dangerous. And in particular, the government has the tendency for collectivism. That's what governments do. And don't underestimate that force. And if you take away the government's ability if you take away the ability to confiscate wealth to the money printing press, you're setting yourself up for a game theoretic sort of chain reaction that could move the government to do even further, more extreme things. And we saw that with, let's say, we saw how far governments can go, even our governments in the West and in Europe, just with COVID. So our governments have the tendency to do that.
There is this risk. I mean, Lex Friedman, Jordan Peterson talk about this a lot in the public sphere, but there's a fundamental problem with humans, which is we are liberty-seeking species, like every other species, a cat, a bacteria, even a rock wants to find its lowest energy state, wants to harness energy in its best way, evolve through its own niche. Like we are liberty-seeking, nature's liberty-seeking, but then we humans, I guess, because we have consciousness, we have creativity, which can be used for the good, but then sometimes we can reach a tipping point where we fall into a collectivist nightmare. Bolshevism, fascism, Maoism, all these isms of the 20th century, they were just the peak of the iceberg. We had the same things happening in the Roman Empire and in the Indian empires and Chinese empires and so on and so forth. And I think we just have to realize that we here in the West, in particular in the United States, we're in an experiment, 250-year-old experiment, which is still ongoing. And the jury is still out. And lots of people are saying from the outside, you guys will not succeed. China is a good example. I think we need to fight for this thing that we have. And the way we fight is through all the institutions that we have, Congress, the White House, elections, all these things are good. But we have now this risk of a backdoor collectivist tendency through the financial markets, which is the Trojan horse here, the Trojan horse of financial markets, because that's the blood of our society. It's the collective power to decide how resources are allocated. That's what an economy is all about, particularly an economy which is based on voluntary free exchange. We need information, and the information is signaled to financial markets. Capital is given to people which have the ability to evolve new markets and generate wealth. This is how we function. The fundamental idea of what we call Western capitalism, or I want to call it ownership capitalism. So this is not about capital per se. This is about who gets to make the decisions. And we decided a long time ago, pre-Adam Smith, this is back to the Renaissance and the Medici, and that ownership is the best way to do that. And that's fine. But then we also had this other side of society where we said, well, ownership is just one side of the coin. How about we also build institutions? Like back in the Florentine days during the Medici, they had the signoria, which is some sort of parliament. The rich were deciding. And then over time we said it should be not just the rich, everybody, and then the women, and so on and so forth. And that's what we have today. We just have this risk now that this beautiful thing that we have, this very fragile, liberty, evolving thing which creates wealth, upward mobility, and all of these things, also has this innate tendency to suppress itself. ESG is just the peak of the iceberg. There's a lot of other problems here, but ESG is a very big problem, and let's just attack this problem. Let's do exactly what Vivek is telling the Bitcoin people to do, which is focus on one thing and solve that problem. Don't go everywhere. So let's solve the problem. Vivek is suggesting that we solve it through the legal path, which is ESG is a breach of constitutional rights. It's a breach of the First Amendment because it forces people, let's say CEOs of companies, to say things they don't really want to say. This is what ESG is doing. And we don't want to be in a situation, a Solzhenitsyn situation, where I know that you lie, that you know that I lie, and I know that you know that I know that you know that I lie, and so on and so forth. We don't want to be in that communist nightmare where everybody pretends to be, and we're not that far away. If we go to large corporations in the US today, there's a lot of tiptoeing around. You have people working in positions they shouldn't be working on, and so on and so forth. Because everybody knows why they're there, and that, there's a lady, let's say at Amazon, she's in charge of some sort of carbon emission initiative, and she's bragging about putting 100,000 electric vehicles on the road in 10 years. And that is a job. 100,000 vehicles, that's nothing. In 10 years, what are you talking about? This is just, saving face. Amazon is doing this to appease somebody on the board. I don't even know. And probably that somebody on the board is there because they have to have a quota. All these things are bad. It's not bad to try to have diversity, but diversity in companies should be based on like in a football team or in a basketball team or in a ballet company. You hire for needs and ability, and then you solve the other social problems through other means in society, not through the back door. This is what Vivek is saying. Again, he's using the law, he's using things like constitutional rights, which I think is the right path. There's a line from Yellowstone, the show Yellowstone, where the Indian woman tells the Indian leader that if it had been up to me, I would have sold all our weapons, all our grandfathers' weapons, and bought lawyers, the best law firms in Madison Avenue, New York with that, and then fought for my land that way. This is how you get things done in the US. So I think Vivek is onto something here. We need to sort of bring the conversation about ESG and the social problems and all of these things to the realm of the law and the judiciary part of our society, which is still relatively well functioning, and then attack it there. The ESG movement is at best just a neglect of fiduciary duty. At worst, it's a fraud, and it's against a constitutional right. The First Amendment of free speech is being breached here, because if you're a CEO or on a board or even an employee in a company,
You're being forced a certain behavior and a certain speech within the context of a company, which is not what you chose for when you get hired. So there is unbelievable pressure from collectivist tendencies for people to behave in a certain way, which is against everything that the United States and the Western ownership capitalist society stands for. Thank you.